Our opening thought comes from Salman Rushdie, who writes, "Exile is a dream of glorious return. Exile is a vision of revolution. Elba, not St. Helena. It is an endless paradox, looking forward by always looking back. The exile is a ball hurled high into the air. He hangs there, frozen in time, translated into a photograph. Denied motion, suspended impossibly above his native earth. He awaits the inevitable moment at which the photograph must begin to move and the earth reclaim its own." Our next reading comes from Edward Said from Reflections on Exile and Other Essays. Exile is strangely compelling to think about, but terrible to experience. It is the unbearable rift forced between a human being and a native place, between the self and its true home. Its essential sadness can never be surmounted. And while it is true that literature and history contain heroic, romantic, glorious, even triumphant episodes in an exile's life, these are no more than efforts meant to overcome the crippling sorrow of estrangement. Our next reading comes from Primo Levi, "If This Is a Man, the Truce." This is the most immediate fruit of exile, of uprooting, the prevalence of the unreal over the real. Everyone dreamed past and future dreams of slavery and redemption, of improbable paradises, of equally mythical and improbable enemies, cosmic enemies, perverse and subtle, who pervade everything like the air. I begin the discourse this morning by sharing a story about a friend of mine named Haji Charalambos from Cyprus. I met Charalambos in Switzerland when I was a student at the Basel Ecumenical Institute of the World Council of Churches. That was in 1991, the spring of 1991. I've mentioned that a few times in here. That was the semester where I was with 51 different students from 33 different countries and 15 different traditions in the Christian tradition. And Charalambos was one of those 51 students, and he was from Cyprus, and he was Greek Orthodox. And he was the elder among us, among the students. He was really old, 55 years old. I turned 59 just a week or so ago. So now I'm 4 years older than the person I looked up to as the elder among us when I was a student at Basel. He really was the elder among us in more than one way. We all looked up to Charalambos. We all respected him, and he was one of the kindest persons you could know, and he was always having us over to talk, and at one point he broke out one of the best bottles of wine from Cyprus I've ever tasted in my entire life, and he was just a wonderful person. And during some of our conversations, it came up that he was living in Paphos in Cyprus, and that was not his true home. The island was his home. He was born and raised in Cyprus, but in 1974, there was an invasion by Turkey of a portion of Cyprus The reasons for it are complex. There's arguments made on both sides of that. So bracket off the reasons for the conflict for the purposes of this experience that I'm sharing with you. But in 1974, Charalambos and his family were removed from their home that his family had had for generations and from the land that his family had had for generations, because that portion of the island was taken over by Turkey in 1974. And if you've ever been to Cyprus, you know there's a line there. It's the United Nations line. The blue helmets are still there in that partition of Cyprus into the Turkish part and the Greek part. And this made Charalambos very sad every time he talked about it. You could tell that it really hurt him that he was not able to live in his family home, not able to continue to be on his family's land. About a year after the institute ended, Charalambos invited me and another one of the students who happened to live in Germany, Klaus, to come and visit Cyprus. I was spending another year in Germany as an exchange student on an exchange fellowship, and so Klaus and I had gotten together a few times while I was in Germany, and we received this invitation from Charalambos to visit Cyprus, so we did. We got on a plane from Germany and flew to Cyprus, a beautiful, beautiful island in the Mediterranean. And when we got there, we were picked up at the airport by Charalambos. We went to Paphos, spent a few nights there around the Paphos region, and he drove us all around the island. We got to spend a total of 5 days there during kind of spring break. And one of the days, he took us in his pickup truck up into the mountains. There's some very nice mountains on Cyprus. In fact, in March, they were still skiing at the top peak of the island. But he took us up into the mountains to look over to the part of the island that the Turkish forces controlled, and he pointed out exactly where his home was in the distance. And he just started to cry uncontrollably as he was looking at his home, as he was looking at the land that had been his for generations. And he just gave both of us a hug. He wanted to share that pain with us, with his friends. And after a moment, we just drove on. He didn't really talk about it for the rest of the day, but you could sense the immense pain that he felt living in exile from his true home. Living in exile is a horrific experience. Being cut off from one's land, from one's community, from one's home, and many aspects of one's way of life is an experience that is in many ways, for some, worse than death. And when whole peoples are forced into exile, the trauma of such an experience is felt for generations. And that trauma was felt in Charalambos' family. We see this generational trauma expressed in literature. We see it expressed in Holy Scriptures of different religious traditions. For example, we see it expressed in the Hebrew Bible as the experience of exile and the attempts to make sense of it are a central theme in a significant portion of the Hebrew Scriptures. And now, every day in the land where those Scriptures were written, we are reminded of the violence and the suffering and the trauma that's caused by exile and the genocide of the people of Palestine. We also see this generational trauma in the lives of our indigenous siblings who were forced from their lands and from their ways by racist militarism, the racist militarism of European colonizers. And we see this generational trauma in the millions of Black Americans whose ancestors were kidnapped from their lands and enslaved, and then after they were given emancipation, still continued to experience segregation, discrimination, and economic injustice for years to come up to this very day. The experience of exile is not necessarily only found in physical removal. It's not only found in physical removal of a person or a people from their land. When the reality of isolation or separation and oppression is so intense, a person or a people can experience living in exile in their own land. They're living on the land still, but it is no longer their home. And it can also be a kind of spiritual exile as well. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by Lincoln, at the urging of my cousin, Cassius Marcellus Clay, always like to add that, 100 years after he signed that Emancipation Proclamation, a person gave one of the most powerful speeches in human history from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in a city named after George Washington, who was enslaving 123 human beings at the time of his death. And that person was Martin Luther King Jr., who said these words in 1963. But 100 years later, the Black person still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Black person is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Black person lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Black person is still languished in the corners of American society and finds themselves an exile in their own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. End quote. From I Have a Dream. One would have hoped that the civil rights legislation of the 1960s would have been the beginning of the end of the centuries-long exile experienced by Black Americans. But with the rise of fascism in our country, this very day, a significant portion of our country, a significant portion of our population, and those also who hold the reins of political power in our land are venerating a man who said that, quote, "We made a huge mistake when we passed the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, end quote. And today, we are seeing cities with Black mayors and large populations of Black people being occupied by our own military. Note that the cities that are being occupied by the National Guard and other portions of the military so far have all had Black mayors, and they have a significant population of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in their cities. And of course, one of these cities is the city where Martin Luther King Jr. shared his dream for America in 1963. The long exile of our Black siblings continues. But the long exile of our Indigenous siblings also continues. The long exile of our LGBTQIA+ siblings continues. The long exile of so many women in this land continues. The exile continues. In fact, I think you could claim that today millions of persons in the United States are living in a kind of exile in our own land, an exile that oppressed groups in our country have experienced for centuries, an exile from economic justice, an exile from political power, an exile from safety and security for our own lives, an exile from justice, and an exile from true freedom, an exile from freedom to do and be what persons want to do and be in our society. And it's creating trauma. It will also create generational trauma. And there will be no return home from exile in our land as long as fascism controls the political, economic, and political landscape in which we live. We will continue to see the exile and the persecution of any and all persons who resist, as the institutions and leaders who are meant to protect us from tyranny continue their capitulation to our fascist regime. Now, the task of caring for each other, the task of protecting each other, the task of resisting injustice and oppression is left up to us, not the institutions, not simply our political leaders. It's left up to us, the people. This is the work of our community. This is the work that our community is called to. And for now, we are a community, whether we like it or not, that is living in exile. But even in exile, we can be present to one another in love. We can be present to one another in justice. We can be with one another as we resist all evil and work together to return back home to a land of liberty and justice for all.